Well, thanks very much. I have a number of slides to go through, and I thought I'd take a different approach than perhaps what some of the talks you've heard before. I understand that you've understood the good, the bad, and the ugly of what the ocean plays in our lives, why we should be concerned about it. But I wanted to perhaps tell you 5 little stories from my life and perhaps reflections on why I think we should be paying a little bit more attention to the ocean than we do at the moment. So one ocean, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. This is an image taken by the Voyager satellite or spacecraft looking back towards Earth from Saturn. This is about 900 million miles away. And if you're like me, I had to actually clean my screen before I gave this presentation. And if you can see just here where I'm pointing at now, that little blue dot right there is Earth. Oh, sorry, that's Earth. And so what's remarkable about it is that it actually is blue. We see it highlighted as blue. And as we get closer, this is about from 1 million miles away. You see that this is, again, this blue planet here and the moon. And this is from the moon looking back towards the blueness of the planet. And what I'm really kind of sort of remarkable about this is actually, we actually live on a planet that's covered primarily by ocean. 2/3 of it is covered by ocean. And yet we know more about the surface of Mars and the surface of the moon than we do of this planet. And I think it's remarkable as well when we think about this further is we spend an enormous amount of money exploring the heavens, searching for alien life. And yet when we look in our own world, we have aliens that we know nothing about that live in our oceans. And this is just an example here of that NASA's budget itself is about 150 times research budget, exploration budget is about 150 times greater than that of the National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration in the United States, who have responsibility for the U.S. Ocean. And so you can see here that really, we need to spend more and think more about the 2/3 of the planet. And what did I mean by one ocean? Often when we see the projections of the ocean itself, we see it divided up into these big basins: the Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, the Arctic, the Antarctic. But I want you to look at it differently. And whenever you talk about the ocean going further, I want you to talk about it as one ocean in the singular. It's not oceans and thinking about it, it's actually an ocean. And quite clearly here, you can see that it is connected. And we know now that if you do something in one part of the ocean, it can affect another. We have great incidences of something happening in the Indian Ocean and suddenly it appearing in the Atlantic Ocean. And so thinking about it differently, one ocean. This is the cusp of a UN decade of ocean science for sustainable development. Don't think about this as purely an exercise of collecting data so we can get all nerdy and sciencey about it. Actually, it's incredibly relevant to the things that we do and the decisions that we make and the health of the future of the ocean. So a lot of what you're thinking about and is part of playing for the planet may have direct relevance for a better understanding of it and connecting people with these issues, and thinking about this, the ocean and the science that's needed in order to better understand it, so that we no longer are perhaps spending so much time searching the heavens, but actually spending more time searching the ocean. But of course, we live in a changing ocean, which I'm sure you've heard about. This is me as a child with my sister on a beach. In some location, around the world that I don't recall specifically where it was, but this was the beginning of my love affair, of the ocean as a child, and particularly, seeing a coral reef. And I hope that some of you, if not all of you, have had an opportunity to see a coral reef. It is amazing, filled with life, bursting with colors and amazing creatures to look at. And for me, that was a calling that I had as a child, that I wanted to become a coral reef scientist. Not the least of which is that growing up in Canada, I was never a fan of the winters and these long, cold winters that would extend, almost 6 months. And this perhaps was a good way for me to escape and spend more time in warm waters. And so flash forward to 1998. I'm sitting on this amazing location, Aldabra Atoll, and I'm sure if you Google it when you get an opportunity to see where it is, but it's about 1,000 kilometers from the nearest international airport. It's like no place you've ever been on the planet. This lagoon that you see here is about the size of Manhattan, can fit comfortably in it. And every day, twice a day, the lagoon fills and empties and fills and empties, like almost like taking a breath in and out. And it's filled with amazing life. On the land, you have the giant tortoise that lumbers about with no fear of humans. You have the last flightless bird that's there that, again, has no fear of humans. And it gives you a sense of what life was like before we were exploiting the planet. Also in the shallows, you have juvenile black-tip sharks that swim back and forth, again, mesmerizing. It's almost like nature's equivalent of a sailing, regatta. Underwater, bounds of life with huge fish colonies, coral reefs, colors. It truly is amazing. But in 1998, I found myself in the midst of a maelstrom of a major event of warming water that caused the coral reefs there to bleach. This will now be very familiar, I hope, to all of you when people talk about coral bleaching. But in case you don't know, corals have a symbiotic relationship with a little tiny plant that sits in their tissue, and that relationship allows them to take up carbon, to take up food, that allows them to survive, to build this really unique skeleton that they have there. And when conditions are such that are unfavorable for that relationship, like warm water, it causes them to bleach. So the pigments themselves, these little plants, leave and create this amazing white effect. And you can imagine looking at this, this looks amazing, fantastic, clean, just unbelievably clear. However, the bad news is that if the hot water, this warm water exists over a longer period of time, it causes the corals to die. And in 1998, you saw about a 95% mortality in some areas. So 95% of corals were dying in some locations, particularly in the Seychelles and in places like the Maldives. Catastrophic impact. And what I thought was interesting at that time was that there was no one really, the scientific community knew about it, but no one was waking up around the world and really seeing this sort of climate change induced major change. And at the time, I described it like a car alarm going off, where at night, where we hear a car alarm going on outside, and we don't get up to look out to see what's going up, and we prefer to put our head or pillow over our head and try to ignore it. And so the challenge is how do we get the world to pay attention to these events that are happening with increasingly more frequency, I would argue as well. And every year now we're hearing of a coral bleaching event on the Great Barrier Reef, for example. And if that wasn't enough, here's a picture of a beach on one of the sides of Aldabra. I mean, look at it. It's covered in plastics, flip-flops, bottles, Q-tips, all sorts of debris, plastic bottles that are there. And we are 1,000 kilometers from the nearest major city. And the real sort of eye-opening for me there in 1998 was, there is no place on the planet that is not going to be untouched in terms of where the ocean and the ocean. And the challenge really has become is how do we get the world, as I said, to pay attention to it? And what I became to realize quite quickly at this time is that change is not going to happen overnight. There is certainly no silver bullet. No single solution is going to help us solve the problems that face the ocean, and that's going to require many of us to come together. While this challenge is a huge, there is a challenge, it's a huge opportunity given the role a healthy ocean plays in our lives. And I'll say a few things about that shortly. And without a doubt, we need a new generation of champions and leaders who see the world in a different manner, from a different manner, not just from land for land's sake, but land and sea, and that is truly connected with one ocean. So, and I'm sorry to say this, but a lot of what I'm telling you now is perhaps old news, and that it is something that is things that are happening that surprisingly have not gotten the attention, but all they've done is increased with scale and urgency and impact that we have there. So just a couple of examples to kind of understand what I mean here. This is taken from 1980. Reader's Digest. So this is not some sort of esoteric scientific journal buried in some sort of library. This is 1980 Reader's Digest, mainstream, written for a wide audience. And the question is, are we fishing too far down the food chain? So the question is, are we fishing too many fish from the sea? Notice the little quote here: too little knowledge and too much exploitation are endangering a vital link in oceanic life systems. This could have easily been written yesterday. And surprisingly, I'm sure you've seen some of these headlines equivalent to it, but this issue hasn't changed. The question is why? And again, it's about visibility, connecting it, making it personal than just posing these sorts of questions. Equally with coral reefs. What's happening to coral reefs? 1978, a colleague of mine posed the question, trouble in paradise. Is this an assault on coral reefs and lagoons? 1978. 1997, questions of whether, what's happening to the reefs. And then in 1998, the rainforests of sea face destruction. This was during the peak time when I was out on Aldabra. So it's surprising to me and rather frustrating that we're not getting the same sort of traction that one would hope in around some of these issues. And equally, this is a cover from 2006, The Last Days of the Ocean. We're pushing our seas to the brink. Can they be saved? Question mark. Good question. But 2006, 15 years ago, again, you could easily change that, and that could just easily say April 2021. So I guess what I'm saying is, that we shouldn't be surprised that this is that these issues are that we're facing, and the scale of them. But the question is, what are we going to do about it now that's going to be different, that's going to be disruptive, to innovate, to really change and make the most of the ability of connecting technology and connecting people to change that. The next area I want to touch on is something what I call the ocean and us, and connecting this with people and making it personal. And I want you to think about that when you think about some of these issues and perhaps some of my frustrations that perhaps we even haven't made it personal. So perhaps let me try to make this personal for you. This is a picture of myself and my son. My son was born in 2005. He was born at the time with a life-limiting condition called cystic fibrosis. It is something that treatment is getting better for all the time, and I can tell you that he is extremely healthy. But at the time, he was given a life expectancy of 45 years, so about approximately to 2050, and we do hope that is going to change. Around the same time, we started to understand that the life expectancy of corals was about 2050, and that we really are under pressure. If things don't change, we could lose up to 90% of the world's coral reefs by 2050. So here yourself, you're sitting here asking, like, where has he gone from cystic fibrosis to the plight of coral reefs? Both have the same in terms of 2050 from 2005. Well, you often perhaps have heard that coral reefs, like some of the terrestrial systems, are often referred to as the medicine cabinets of the sea. And so we know that there are many life-saving products that can be derived from the sea, some of the drugs that we use today. And so rather perversely, my sort of plight and the work that I do has suddenly taken on a completely different meaning. And it's almost a race against time in order to save coral reefs, save your children. And I know that certainly something like this is very powerful to motivate others to think about and connect it to. So do we want to be losing coral reefs and losing these incredible biodiversity that could be potentially valuable to our well-being and health, going forward? Probably not. And if that wasn't enough, we know that the cure for COVID-19 and other viruses and future diseases that the planet holds could come from the sea. And so we seem to almost be like, shooting ourselves in the foot because we don't like the color of our socks. It seems crazy that we wouldn't want to preserve this in some way and really return the health of the ocean, because like it or not, I would argue that that we need the ocean far more than the ocean needs us into the future. And just one final point on this, and again, I don't want to belabor this, but I think it's important to recognize and connecting this further. Um, some of you may be familiar with something called antimicrobial resistance. This is essentially when we and indeed other animals become infected with bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotics that we have available to us. And if there is no change at the moment, by 2050, more than 10 million deaths a year will be attributed to antimicrobial resistance that is larger than predicted than cancer at that particular time. And so the estimated economic impact is about $100 trillion. So, but we also know that many of these perhaps antibiotics and compounds are potentially available in the ocean. So rethinking and reimagining how important the ocean is to us in a personal way, is it going to be extremely important. But I also wanted to leave you with perhaps some good news, and not leave it on perhaps just doom and gloom. We live in very unprecedented times in terms of political attention for the ocean. We know this year, for example, that people are calling this the ocean super year. And what I mean by that is that you have some big policy moments or big convenings whereby the ocean will feature, whether it is in the G7, the G20, the UN climate change conference later this year in Glasgow, or indeed the UN Food System Summit in September later this year. So, thankfully, the ocean is starting to take its rightful place, within the political, agenda and some of these policy fora, so that they're being recognized for the contribution that they make to our economies, to our well-being, and certainly to the health of the planet. That political momentum is carrying forward. This is something I was involved with over the last year. This is the high-level panel for a sustainable ocean economy. 14 heads of state that have come together to come up with a new way of an approach to the ocean, and to came up with a series of recommendations that said, if we effectively protect the ocean, and you probably heard over the last weeks that you've been having some of these talks that 30%, we need to protect 30% of the ocean by 2030. So if you effectively protect it, we can sustainably produce from it, so we can still continue to get the nutrition, the food that we rely on from the ocean, and that we can equitably prosper. That all those jobs, those livelihoods that are intimately connected with the health of the ocean can still continue in a way. So you don't have to have profitability and not have sustainability. Indeed, you can have both, and certainly through the work of the panel and these 14 heads of state who've committed to this, first time in history outside of formal processes that you have 14 leaders that are taking this approach. We also have, excitingly, companies and the private sector stepping up and doing their part. This was just announced yesterday. BMW, Volvo, Samsung, and Google have all said, you know what? We're not going to source any kind of minerals from the bottom of the ocean, a place that hasn't been, perhaps one of the last few places on the planet that has not been disturbed by humans, to make sure that we're not doing that until we really understand what's going on down there. So really taking that firm commitment. It goes even further with the Global Tuna Alliance. The Global Tuna Alliance is a number of retailers that have gotten together to say, actually, we want to be sure that we are sustainably sourcing and supplying our customers with tuna that is fully traceable, that is minimizing the impact on the ocean, and in fact we're using our collective force to make sure that it's not being fished and destructively and overfished in different areas of the world. So private sector really coming together. I also wanted to briefly mention that what going forward from what we do in the ocean is going to require some very bold decisions and bold maneuvers that from our leaders that are in a position to do that. And sometimes you have to make really tough decisions. So just by way of an example, in 1992, the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans Canada was instructed by the Prime Minister overnight to close the cod fishery on the Grand Banks, so off the east coast of Canada. This was a 500-year-old tradition that employed over 35,000 people. And overnight, those 35,000 plus people lost their jobs, and that 500-year tradition ended. And it was one of the hardest decisions. When I spoke to the prime minister at the time, he said it was one of the hardest decisions he had to ever make in his entire political career, but it was the right decision. They would almost fish down to the last bit of cod that was there. And 30 years later, we're starting to see some come back off the cod. It may not return to the historical levels, but the point here is that if we take some of these bold decisions, the ocean has this incredible capacity for resilience and coming back. We just need to give it a chance in order to do so. So it's going to require some very bold decisions to address some of these issues that I'm sure you've heard about over these last few weeks when you've been hearing some of these talks. I'm also pleased to see that some of these really unique partnerships are coming together to say, you know what, pre-competitively, we're going to take a step out of the competition and what we do in our day-to-day lives. Some of them are not necessarily naturally connected with the ocean, but we're going to think about this. What can we do as a collective group if we pool our resources to come together, whether it's like yourselves in the gaming computing world, whether it's in the fashion world, whether it's in the sailing community, to really do something to change and reach out and connect to new audiences in order to really make a difference. Like any talk, I think I need to have a little bit of gratuitous, charismatic megafauna. Here's a fantastic humpback. But I think when any of these things, when you think about them, I always want you to think about the yin and the yang. You have the beautiful animals underneath, but also this is a people issue. There are people around the planet that are depending on the ocean for feeding themselves, for their livelihoods. And so just as very much about biodiversity and nature issue, it's a relationship of people. And we know if we don't get that relationship right, as the last year of the pandemic has shown us, we know that can be problematic in that relationship. So always remember, people, planet, ocean. And just by way of a few numbers, and you probably have seen these, and I felt I'd be remiss if I didn't say just a little bit about this, is a healthy ocean actually can deliver a lot of food, a lot of jobs, incredible amount of money, and an amazing amount of energy that doesn't come at a cost to the planet and the health of the ocean. And in fact, if you add up a number of solutions, you can get about a 1/5 of the way to the 1.5 degree target by 2050. And I want to touch on that a little bit further, if I may. And this is the only science bit of graph that I was going to promise I was going to show in this. But if you add up all these different solutions, whether it's ocean-based renewable energy, sourcing. So as a consumer, the questions you ask, can you source more renewable energy? How are your goods around the world being transported? What are the state of your coastal marine ecosystems? Thinking more about your diets. Where do we eat on the food chain? How do we eat from the sea? And if you added up all of these areas, this is about taking about 2.5 billion cars off the road per year. So why wouldn't we want to do that and think about this as far as taking these steps as far as climate change is and being the greatest ally for fighting against climate change? And I think it's important to think about this is that it's when you think about the ocean, the ocean is not too big to fail, nor is it too big to fix. It's simply too big to ignore. And we have to remind ourselves that when we think about the problems facing the ocean, yeah, okay, it may be big and it may be hard, but we simply just cannot ignore it. Throughout the political dimensions, through business, we are connected to it one way, or another. So let's just leave you with this final thought. There is no silver bullet for this that's going to solve everything. And I thought to myself, and I was mentioning this to Deborah earlier, I was lying in bed this morning with my wife talking about this and saying, well, what are you going to say? What are the things that you want people to do, the solutions? And there is just the simple of the matter is there's just no straightforward answer to that. I could come up easy with a long list of things, and someone else, a colleague of mine, could come up with a different list of things to come up. Perhaps what I can ask you and the things that you do are, one, is to engage with those organizations out there that are doing amazing things on the ground. And I've just listed a few of them, obviously my own institution that I've listed here, but others that my colleagues are working in different areas in parts of Africa, the Mediterranean, Central America, the Indian Ocean, that are doing really interesting things that would really benefit by working with people like yourselves to amplify some of those ocean messages, get the word out, connect people. and make it relevant to them, connecting people with the ocean and the things that are important, so it doesn't become just such an abstract notion, that actually there are things that you could be doing, and having people take their own initiative to do that, and certainly to transform the ocean itself, transform the way we behave around it, transform the way we think about it, transform the health of the ocean, going forward. So amplify, connect, transform. It's well within your power to do that. So with that, perhaps a slightly different approach to, and a few stories and thoughts from me on thinking about the ocean, reimagining, rethinking the way that you could be interacting with it, the things that you could be doing, connecting people to really motivate change. I think we live in an unprecedented time in terms of the level of interest, but also what we can do about it and how we can motivate communities around the world to take action. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much, Kristian. I definitely had a tear or two going throughout that. So I think you've just done a wonderful job in getting us to connect with that message. And if we can even do like a fragment of what you have done, with our players, I think that's going to be really powerful. I want to open it up to questions from all of you, because I always have mine, but let's give the floor to other people.
Hi, sorry, I know that you touched base, you came back on the Netflix documentary Seaspiracy at the beginning of the talk, but sorry, I had to take my son to daycare, so I wasn't quite listening, but I think you mentioned that, stopping or eating less fish wasn't necessarily the greatest option. Could you come back on what you were expressing at that time?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that I struggle like this with a number of issues, not just as necessarily for, just on fish, and perhaps by way of an example. About 2 years ago, there was a BBC series documentary that looked around sort of different issues facing the ocean, and obviously plastic featured in one of those. And the presenter at the time went out on a reef in the Philippines, and came back with a whole number of these small sachets of shampoo, condiments, and was aghast that they were sort of littering, and was sort of pointing the responsibility at at some of the fast moving consumer goods companies. And what struck me about that was, well, why is that happening? And I guess if you started to look at some of the systemic issues there, you started to unpack a little further. Well, if let's say if I'm earning maybe $5 a day, and the choices I have to make between either feeding my family and buying a $2 bottle of shampoo, let's say, I'm going to make, or a let's say a 25-cent sachet of shampoo. Well, those are the choices I know I'm going to, it's going to be easy for me. I'm going to buy those sachet, and then I'm going to spend money on the food. And that dimension was not covered in that documentary. It was more just pointing the fingers on it. And to me, it just sort of was indicative of perhaps understanding, walking a mile in someone else's shoes and really understanding the challenges and the choices that they have to make. And so whilst, you and I on this call may have the flexibility to say, actually, I am not going to eat, I'm going to stop eating fish or a particular type of fish, or doing that. That perhaps is not going to be for so many people of the, on the planet. And so I guess in terms of Seaspiracy, and I freely admit I haven't seen it. I've just heard some of the messages coming out of it. I feel that there are perhaps other ways that which we can be affecting change. Agreeably, for example, getting some of the retailers or people to ask questions about can the fish you're eating, at least at an industrial scale, be be available, that they're not have slaves, and and they're not human rights abuses that are associated with them. And so I just think it's important that yes, we can shine a light on something, but we also need to have perhaps a more of a nuanced approach in terms of solutions than just a broad brush stroke of saying ban it or stop it completely overnight, because it's just so linked with people, and I think that people dimension, for me at least, is extremely important.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I completely agree with that. I hadn't thought about it that way. I have another question, unless somebody else has any other question. So you mentioned that there were, I think, 14 or 18 head of states that were coming together to think about how to preserve our oceans. But I noticed that the United States and China aren't really onto that board and stuff like that, since they're probably some of the biggest influencers. How does that impact our capacity to have change happen?
Yep. So that's a very astute observation. And at the time the Ocean Panel was formed, there was a very different administration in the United States, and so it was never going to be a starter anyway. Having said that, there is interest about expanding that group, and the original focus of it was could we get together a number of like minds at that particular time, from different geographies around the world, that not necessarily to include everybody, but it counts for about 30% of their national waters, and to perhaps try to build a movement and momentum. So there's considerable discussion with places like the United States and China. I think with China, it's going to take a very different approach, and I would hope that that we could start sort of rethinking about how looking for more disincentives and incentives for the behavior of China, in particularly in some of these areas, and there has been a little bit of progress, I think, in that respect. But let's not all think about perhaps pointing the fingers at China in terms of consumption of seafood. I think if you looked at consumption of seafood within, let's say, Europe, the majority of the seafood that we eat is high on the food chain, so that's sort of the top predators in the ocean, and which are very few when you start getting higher at that. And do we want the rest of the world to be eating at that level? There'd be nothing left in the nothing left in the sea. So it's not that we saying you can't, but I think even here, certainly the United Kingdom, we need to be eating much lower on that on that food chain if we want to continue to eat seafood.
Great, thank you so much.
And I have a question while we're
Kristian.
waiting. Oh no, you go first.
Sorry. No, go ahead. Ladies first.
Oh, come on, Arno. Now what was my question? Oh, you had mentioned that, the Prime Minister of Canada, many years ago, made a really tough call in like banning that, and made just that unilateral decision, and then lots of people lost their jobs. And when we heard a talk from Enric, I think it's yesterday or the other day, who knows, time, he was saying that it's really hard to get political leaders to do something unless there's something in it for them. And so I'm wondering, like, with that decision that obviously was very hard to make and was very bold, like, what is the ratio of leaders who will just do the right thing versus need to be convinced by having some kind of personal buy-in?
It's very few, unfortunately. And it happened at the time, the Prime Minister at the time in Canada was an enlightened man who really had a huge appetite for science and listening to scientists. So I think, but increasingly, we've done a great disservice. And I don't know if Enrique covered this yesterday, but I think we've done ourselves a great service to talk about marine protected areas as parks in the sea. And I'm equally culpable of that, in as much as that it's not just about preserving biodiversity. You will know from Enrique's talk that marine protected areas can take up more carbon. They can feed people. They can put money in people's pockets. And and as such, they should be treated as a country's infrastructure. So they shouldn't be a nice to have. They should be an essential and should be invested in such. And I think the winds of that are changing, so that we are having more leaders that are waking up to the fact of the economics and the return on investment that can be made from investing in the ocean. But also, I would say that you heard me when I think I mentioned that we need a new generation of leaders, and we can't just rely on hoping that we'll have someone that has that this resonates with, but in fact that we have some the leaders that are coming up through the system that understand this, that don't have to be sort of re-educated or retrofit or and suddenly schooled in the way of what's happening in 2/3 of the planet. We need them to be integrating this and thinking about it going forward. So I'm hoping, Deborah, that we're having more leaders that are coming up who this is becoming second nature and is not just a nice to have, but they see it as essential and are willing to take bold decisions. And I think we're seeing that some of those bold decisions hopefully are having more examples of where they actually are leading to things that are going to be beneficial.
Cool, thank you. Arnaud, you're up.
Okay, thanks, Kristian, for this wonderful talk. It was really inspiring. Something I was wondering, so you're recommending people to try to connect with the ocean. And one example you gave very early on during your talk was, have you actually seen the coral reef once in your life? And I think this is obviously the best way for people to make this like eureka moment, to instantly connect with the reef and want to protect it. However, tourism is also a cause of coral reef destruction. So I'm wondering what should we do? Should we encourage people to see it by themselves, or should we say, don't go yourself and just like make video games, movies, everything to just inspire people? It wouldn't have the same impact. Is there a way for people to really experience that without destroying the reef? And what should we recommend to people?
Yeah, absolutely. Arnaud, there are, if nothing else, this last year has taught us that again, the importance of nature. And I think that we need to think about these activities going forward that everyone's, that we're all talking about, is how can we make these activities regenerative? And so that whatever we're doing is not the detriment to the health of the ocean, but actually is regenerating the health of the ocean. And as far as tourism is concerned, again, I go back to, I go back to my point when I was making to Deborah here, is that, that a lot of people rely on tourism. I mean, the GDP of Jamaica, 40% of it is related to tourism. And so, the majority of people that are going to some of these destinations, they want to see some things underwater. They want to have clean beaches and they want to have clear water. But I think there are ways at which we can interact, with coral reefs if, people just understand them and are not treating them, as though they were, a bunch of rocks, colored rocks underwater, and they can step all over them and do that. And it stuns me when, I've been in Thailand where, a bunch of snorkelers are dumped out onto the reef, and they're standing on it. They're, kind of touching it, and that's fine if that's what the tourism companies are encouraging. But again, they're shooting themselves in the foot, because people are going to stop wanting to come there, and they're going to stop wanting to come because no one wants to see a dead reef. So I think there are ways at which which we both the tourism industry needs to invest, and not just assume that these services that they've been receiving for millennia are going to continue, but actually think about what is their role, what is their part in this, so that they can make sure that visitors to coral reefs are enjoying them, but not doing them at the detriment. And it's just changing that behavior. But I think it's much easier for them to be to play that role and to be given incentives by the government to play that role, whatever is needed, then, you know, the individual to change their behavior. You know, most of the time consumers and those people going, the tourists, are going to follow the rules that have been set out because that's, you know, that's what's been said, as opposed to them doing it because it's a moral imperative. I think you need to have more than that, at least going forward.
Thank you.
I just wanted to jump off of what this conversation is about, and I missed the beginning, so I apologize if this has been covered, but what are your thoughts on virtual tourism? So for example, like games like Beyond Blue, they take place in the oceans, and when I played it, I just felt a visceral connection to that. And
I mean, totally. I mean, I you know, when during lockdown, you know, the beginning of lockdown, you know, this is one of the first purchases I made, and that was more to sort of explore the opportunities and for, you know, as an escape. But I've just been blown away by the experience that you can have, you know, in that virtual world, and if there are ways at which you can, you know, motivate that and get people inspired, just by the sights and sounds and that immersive experience in some way, I would strongly encourage that. I mean, you know, and it hopefully when you start to understand this a little bit more and the connections without having to leave your home, but it may motivate you to do something a little bit differently and to ask tougher questions, you know, about it. I think, you know, most of us are unlikely to see a mountain gorilla in the wild. You know, if you're a lucky few that get to do that, but we still care about them. You know, we still, you know, are and want to see them, and we want to feel connected to it. So I think, you know, that point about, you know, the role of this is sort of, you know, as I said at the end of my talk, was just about the amplification, the connection, you know, to these issues, and using these amazing imagery and experiences that hopefully will transform behavior. So I think there's absolutely, you know, a role, and I feel, and you'll know much better than that the technology is just moving leaps and bounds, so that you know, it does provide that, you know, that connection and that immersive experience that will help motivate change.
Thank you.
I have another one, if
Please.
if I have time for. So Kristian, if you had a team, game dev team, and the budget to make the perfect game to save the ocean, what do you think this game would look like? Have you ever thought about that? Like what kind of experience would we want the player to have? What kind of thing you would want to teach the player? What kind of behavior you would want to transfer to them?
That's a really good question. I oscillate, I know, about a whole range of these things. I mean, I have, you know, I have 3 children, and they are from 16 downwards, and you know, and they're all playing some sort of game, you know, and I think there's some, you know, there's something about the I think it's one thing to kind of do the kind of the virtual experience and sort of swim around, as it were, but it almost feels like you know, in some respects you could have these little sort of challenges of race against time, and trying to solve some of these, you know, these issues facing the ocean that are, you know, that you do that in, you know, with a sort of a battle royale type of approach, where you have, you know, others that are playing and racing against it and trying to do this, and to show the kind of collective, if you were to solve and change some of these things, how, you know, these different outcomes that would occur. And I often felt that if there was a way to somehow combine that with some sort of contribution to a scientific exercise as well, I mean, that would be really interesting, you know, that unbeknownst to the players, they are actually, you know, doing something that contributes to our understanding, or, you know, to a bigger undertaking as far as addressing some of these issues. It could even, you know, be testing out some of these bonkers ideas that people have, they're putting on the table, you know, and I've heard some really crazy ideas, and you're kind of thinking, well, you know, could these actually work? You know, they could, if you got them to scale, and you know, again, you can put some of these things on the table and get people to test them out. So I think, you know, for me, having some sort of, you know, plot where it's sort of, you know, the race against time and the need to solve things, but it doesn't come across as being, you know, with a big stick of here are the issues but people are starting to make some of those connections.
Good. Lot of food for thought. Thanks.
Definitely. Any more questions from the rest of you? No, I hear quiet. I guess one more question I had was around how effective is it for, like, when we say like the voice of the people in like government action and in swaying opinion and that kind of thing? How useful is it to hear the voice of the people, whether it be, you know, signing petitions or sharing things on social media, etc.? Is that something that
very, very powerful? No, and I think look, if you had 280 million people that are playing a game and they voice, you know, some sort of opinion or something that they you know, are concerned about, you know, that's going to have an impact. And even more so, we find that whilst a politician is, you know, thinks what I have to say or a scientist has to say is quite important, at the end of the day, it's going to be a bunch of people that are going to get them elected, and, you know, they have to listen to their constituency, and, you know, in these political cycles, and what is going to be really important, and, you know, and you know, one shouldn't think this is ever impossible. You know, if you'd said to me, I don't know, 20 years ago, if you'd said to me that smoking will be banned in all sort of Parisian cafes and restaurants, or in bars in Dublin, I would have said you're barking mad. There's not a chance in hell that that's going to happen, you know. But there was a significant momentum behind the science that then was translated to the mainstream, you know, and you know, it suddenly created a movement, and that movement then led to the government thinking, well, actually, you know, this is something that people care about. You know, something that people care about, in which we need to respond to it in a way that is going to, you know, make a difference. And so I think, you know, these are the sorts of things that you know, we can have some sort of common voice and elicit that change. I mean, I think, you know, you can't just say, you know, to a decision maker or politician, say, okay, I want you to stop fishing overnight. They're people's livelihoods. They have to balance it off. But there are other ways at which we can, you know, point out the fallacy of the argument, or the misguided economics of it that become, you know, very powerful and create that change that we want to happen.
Yeah, I agree. That smoking ban example, so true. I remember going in my younger days, going to clubs and reeking of smoke when I got home and having to wash my hair. And then, yeah, and it seemed like almost overnight. It was like, oh, actually, we're not allowed to smoke in bars anymore. Yeah, really interesting.
When someone says to me, you know, yeah, it's impossible that we can stop that, you know, about $23 billion are sort of lost in illegal fishing, you know, globally a year. And when someone says, well, it's impossible to stop, I think nothing is impossible. You know, we shouldn't ever have that barrier just because it's hard. We shouldn't try to do something about it, you know, and, you know, what's happening in the ocean is hard. It's out of sight, out of mind for most people. And I think, going back to your point, Arno, the role that you and others can play is stop and making it out of sight and out of mind. Connect people, you know, with it. You know, Jennifer, you know, if you're involved in the virtual world, and that approach, you know, bring that to life and connect it to people, so that they understand that you know, this is not just about, you know, saving a coral reef. It could be about saving your great Aunt May, or you know, someone, you know, a child down the road who's going to need that antibiotic that is going to make a, you know, it's going to make a life or death, and that's coming from the ocean. And do we want to risk that? I'm not sure I want to.
Yeah, really good point. We had somebody who's like a sustainability expert slash marketing kind of activist give a talk, and he was saying that the sort of journey of getting people to take action is you have to see something and then understand it, and then you love it, and that's when you want to protect it. So I think sometimes we're going at things the opposite way, and we're sort of saying, you see it and now just protect it. You're like, yeah, but I don't care about it yet. So I think it's getting people to care, right?
Absolutely true. And if we put half the amount of budget into the sort of marketing, advertising that goes into, you know, sort of supermarkets to buy goods, I mean, there is a whole school of thought around that, you know, whether there's smells, there are things that are particular eye line, or things that, you know, that are driving us to buy these products. And we don't know why we're buying them, but suddenly in our shopping carts, we've purchased them. And, you know, it's a mystery. So if people could do that, then surely we can, you know, we can change behavior in a way that motivates that change that we want. But we just need to put those budgets and the money in the right places to do that.
Awesome.